So we'll look at the effects of copyright on science, follow-on science, and we'll use the World War II book replication program. So what are copyrights? They're essentially temporary monopoly rights. I don't need to explain that to this crowd. So I've worked on copyrights in other settings. I've done some previous work on the effects of copyright on books, and in particular on the 1814 Act, the UK Copyright Act. And so what we find there is that copyrights, an extension in the length of copyright protection that disproportionately affected books by dead authors, increased the price of books by dead authors. So we see that copyrights increase price. And we also found that copyrights increase payments to authors. And then in work on 19th century opera, we're now finding that copyrights can actually encourage creativity by encouraging new operas and better operas. But there's also a flip side to this, which is that the temporary monopoly rights that are provided by construction restrict access to these works. And that's a particular problem when copyrights today are extremely long-lived. So it is a problem in science, because in science, anything that we do today builds on stuff that people have done before. So that means if I restrict access to previous knowledge, say in the forms of books, then essentially what we would expect to happen is that the costs of producing new knowledge is going to increase. And so this has been called cumulative innovation, most prominently by Suzanne Schotchmer. And then there's also a quote that's often used by Isaac Newton, which is obviously it's not used the way Newton intended it, but that's a different story. So, but essentially the argument is that we see further because we are on the shoulders of giants. To the best of my knowledge, there's no systematic evidence to date on the effects of copyrights on cumulative knowledge, on cumulative innovation in the sciences. And so a lot of this is due to a lack of experimental evidence. So this is something that Martin has alluded to, that modern copyright laws are changed in response to lobbying. So then it's difficult to determine any causal effects if I see changes in the price or an output for a good whose owners have just lobbied for a change in the law. So the causality could also go the other way around. So what we're doing here, we're trying to address this issue by using the World War II book republication program. The fact that what we're using is that it was a result of World War II. It was an act of compulsory licensing that was a continuation of the Trading with the Enemy Act from 1919, where the US essentially got mad at the Germans for committing atrocities in the war and decided to take all enemy-owned property. And then World War II happened, and they said, like, well, now let's take it again, but this time let's not only take the patents, also let's take their books. And so that's what we're using in this paper. So we found lists of these books that were licensed, and we're going to see whether the books that were licensed, where essentially the copyrights were violated and the price of these books was significantly reduced, whether they became more used in US science. So we're looking at 535 books, and US publishers then offered these books for a significantly lower price. The data that we collected here includes the title, the author, the publication year, the subject, and the US license and the original price and the reproduction price for 231 books for chemicals and 60 books for mathematics. And so this is an example of one of these books. It's the Beilstein's Handbook of Organic Chemistry.
It's one of the, it's a standard work where you can look up any types of the properties of anorganic chemicals, and it's really expensive. It's sold for $2,000 at a before it was republished. So these books were published by 14 publishers, but they were primarily published by Dovers and Edwards. So those were the big guys. And then here's an example. This is Hilbert and Courant's book, Methoden der mathematischen Physik. And then it's this is a recent version, but in our historical data, they didn't bother translating it. So the data that we did, we couldn't find a cover for the new book that was in German, but the new book, the republication the book remained in German. And so it was republished. It was republished for a lower price in German in the United States. Why is that? Well, everybody until the 1960s, 1970s, if you wanted to do chemistry or mathematics, you had to speak some German in the US. So we collect price data for these guys. So this is going back to the Beilstein example. Beilstein sold for an original price of $2,000, and then it sold for a reproduction price of $400. So a dramatic decline in price. Then we are building a control group of Swiss books. Why Swiss books? Well, we needed a country that also had a very good chemical industry and good mathematicians, but wasn't subject to the war. So and Switzerland is neutral, so it's perfect. So we have 495 books with Swiss-owned copyrights. And so as a first approximation, we're just using the items that are in the National Swiss Library. So we just collected all this data for chemistry and mathematics from the Swiss Library, and we're throwing out all the books that don't have any citations. And so an example of that is the Invariantentheorie algebraischer Formen, which means nothing to me either. And then we collect citations for all of these books. So essentially, we're using Google Scholar because Google Scholar is the best source for getting data from abroad. So a lot of the standard sources that people have used don't record much information from European libraries. Google is much more inclusive than other settings. And so we collect here roughly 12,000 citations by new publications. So, and that's our measure for new knowledge that builds on existing knowledge. Now, to believe that, obviously you have to believe that citations are a measure of knowledge flow. So in some way, what I'm asking you, what we're using here is that if you cite something, then you've used it in your work. Now, I think you may take issue with that, but I guess I'm giving everybody the benefit of the doubt. So we're doing this for 236 chemistry books and 51 mathematics books. And then what we've done so far, so we're still in the data collection process, but we've had an RA go through all these 12,000 citations and assign them to a language. So basically, we're looking at English language citations, and we're differentiating them from other languages, because only the English language citations, only the English language publications had access to the U.S. to the U.S. republication program. And we use other languages in a placebo test. And this is like what you see there is an example of the data, what it looks like. So this is an example of the citations that we see to Beilstein. So this is this handbook that we were talking about before. And so until 1940, there's some noise in the data, but we really see citations really go up after 1960, 1970. So this is a book that has been around and that was recognized as being super important in 1918, but it was so expensive that nobody or very few people could use it. And I'll show you one thing we're doing right now. We're collecting geographic data. So I'll show you some geographic data. So what we think happens is that once the price of the book drops, it's cities outside of Cambridge, Massachusetts, can afford to buy the book. And I'll show you some examples of that as well.
May I just ask, what's the y-axis?
Oh, citations per year.
But not one.
Sorry, citations per year?
Because there would be half a citation per year.
That is a very good point. Yes. I think we actually did it at 2-year intervals. So, because otherwise it would look even messier. But yes, look at it. It looks like it's 2-year intervals there. So it's like citations per 2 years, but then calculated at the annual level, which is confusing. Yes. Okay, I'll fix that. Thanks. So then another one is Couron's Methoden der mathematischen Physik. So you look at that until 1940, not much going on, and then a lot of it goes up afterwards, and then down again. And then this is something that economists are really interested in, as John von Neumann's work. And so that actually, when you look at it, there's a little bit of a pre-trend there, and we'll go and look at different ways in addressing that pre-trend later. So in the aggregate data, so now I'm putting all these citations together. So what we see is that citations to these book republication program books, which I'll just call the BRP books, the licensed books, increase by a factor of 2.2. And the Swiss books, which are in the control group, they increase a little bit as well, but they don't increase at all in any comparable way. They stay relatively flat during this time. So when you put this in the comparisons of means, there's a 7-fold increase in news publications citing the BRP books. And by comparison in the control group, there's only a 2-fold increase. So what we can already see here is that the citations to BRP books increase a lot more. And then we're throwing this into regressions, which are basically the most basic specification here is just a difference in difference, where we just compare the mean number of citations per book and year after the program with the pre-period. And so we're comparing the increase in citations for the licensed books and the control group, which are the Swiss books. And then, because there are some things that we can't observe, we would like to control for it, we're putting in a bunch of controls. So the most important ones are the citation year fixed effects. So we're controlling for the citation years because it could be that there's an increase in science in a given field that's independent and that increases the number of citations overall. We're controlling for that. We're also controlling for publication year fixed effects. It could be that there are cohorts of science or that are especially productive. We're controlling for that as well. So when you do that, what we see is that there's a 5-fold increase in citations to licensed book compared with the control group. And then I showed you in the example von Neumann, you saw there was a linear pre-trend. So there was, or not a linear pre-trend, there's a pre-trend. And so that pre-trend could happen because there could be a cohort effect for publications of a book. Say a book in the first year probably doesn't get that many citations. When you look at your own citations, a paper doesn't get that many citations in the first years. But then as the paper becomes more famous, other people start citing it as well. And then after a while, it just sort of dies off. So we're going to control for that. And when we control for that, the effect actually goes down a little bit. But it's still almost a 5-fold increase. So now we want to look at the mechanism by which the giving access to these books, by the mechanism by which weaker copyrights could actually encourage follow-on science.
And so we start by just thinking about how knowledge is produced. And so I'm just going to show you like a very simple model now, that the only purpose of this model is to be clear about the stuff that we have to assume to get some predictions. So essentially what we're doing is we're creating a knowledge production function where we're assuming that the scientists can either produce or just look out of the window, do nothing, and enjoy life. Now, if he decides to produce, he has to use physical capital in some shape or form, which could be very little. It could just be a pencil and paper, or it could be a research lab. And he has to use previous knowledge. And then when he produces the knowledge, he gets some kind of payoff, which can be money or fame or whatever you want. A raise. So when you put that into the model, essentially what you get, the basic prediction that you get is that there's going to be a threshold price for previous knowledge above which it's not worth the scientist's time to produce knowledge because access to existing knowledge is just too high. Access is just too expensive. So what that means, the first prediction of this simple model is essentially that when you increase the price of previous knowledge, you'll get less new knowledge. And so then we test this by using the price data. So now what we're doing in these regressions, we're doing the same regression that we had before, but now we're interacting the basic difference in difference estimator with a variable, with an additional variable for a 10% decline or for percentage change in the price. And so what we find here is that a 10% decline in price is associated with about 0.1 additional citations, which is roughly 1.5-fold increase. And then so one thing that you want to look at when somebody shows you a difference in difference regression is that you don't want see anything until the experiment happens, and then you'd like something to see afterwards, a time effect that sort of makes sense. And so this is what we show you here. You look again, there's a little bit of a pre-trend leading until 1942, and then there's the war. The war makes it a lot harder for science to use this input of the German books, and then after the war it increases again. So it's not like super pretty and it's not super ugly, which makes me happy. So I think the middle is the right way in these graphs. Okay, so then just that very simple model also gives us another prediction, which is that if I look across disciplines, then a discipline that's intensive in physical capital should have a smaller effect of reductions in the price of knowledge than a discipline that is more intensive in human capital. And so once you think about this, it's really simple and intuitive, right? So the guy with the big hat is David Hilbert, a mathematician. Right, so the only thing that he needs to be productive is a pen, pencil, and that big brain. Right? But if you are actually an industrial chemist, you can be as smart as you want. If you don't have access to a research lab, there's just so much you can do with Beilstein's organic chemistry. So you get access to the book now. I'll show you like some of these, essentially where these books move now, they'll move to places like Missouri. So you can find out about the book, or you read the book, but you still don't have a lab. So there's less you can do with it for chemistry than for mathematics. So that's the basic intuition of this prediction. And so now we're going to test it, and we're testing it very simple. First, we're just going to look at the comparisons of means. So what we want to see here is whether the relative increase is larger for mathematics than for chemistry. So we have a 1.5-fold increase in citations to BRP books in chemistry. And these are the citations per year in chemistry. It looks all right? There's not much going on until at the end of the war, which is exactly what we want to see. And then afterwards, there's an increase. There's a lot of noise in the data. And then, but for the math books, there's actually a much larger increase. For the math books, there's a 5-fold increase in citations to BRP books. And also, when you look at just looking at the raw data, the data for math just looks a lot more striking. So there's noise in the BRP books, but the relative increase is much, much larger, which I think is a really interesting result. So then we're going to put this again in this very simple different diff framework that we used before, and now our interaction is going to be the interaction with mathematics. And so what we see is that chemistry books receive 0.24 additional citations. That's a 300% increase in these regressions. And then math books, they experience a 10-fold increase. So it's a dramatic, significant, economically and statistically, and I care more about the economic significance. It's a big increase. It's a big differential increase. And so the price effect, now I'm combining those two, so I'm doing essentially the quadruple interaction, and so the price effect is also larger. So now we're going to do a bunch of robustness checks. So I think one thing that's sort of nice about lots of issues that you can have with economists, right? But the thing that I think is sort of nice is that it gives you a clear framework of thinking through some of the issues that you could have, that we can have with this test. And so we're going to address these one. So I think the most important empirical challenge for our results is that the BRP books are not a random sample. So US publishers didn't go and just say well, I'm just going to publish any book now. They took a look at the books that were available for licensing, and they picked the ones that they thought actually they would experience some demand. Now, I think it's really important to keep in mind that issue affects only our most basic specification, because when we're looking at the price effects and we're looking at the within-discipline effects, which I think are sort of the most interesting results, we're looking within the sample of BRP books, and we're comparing within the sample of BRP books to the Swiss books as a control. But the variation that we use for these tests is within, so they're all selected to be published, so we're controlling for that. But now we're going to do a placebo test anyway as a robustness check for the basic specification. And so what we're using here is we're using the effect on the non-English citations. And so this is the placebo. Again, it's a very rough placebo for now. And so what we're seeing is that there's no significant effect on the non-English citations. They increase, but they don't increase as much. And in some way, actually, you would expect them to increase because we left in the German citations, right? And I already told you that the books were in German. So even though most of the mathematicians and chemists at the time in the US, they had the Americans, they had sort of a passive knowledge. They wouldn't themselves write in German, but some of them may have. So there's the standard mathematician they would consume in German, but then they would write in English, and that's what we're capturing in the main specifications. But here, one of the reasons why we see an effect is actually also an effect of the BRP. So in some way, we're stacking in this placebo test, leaving them in there, we're stacking the deck against us. We're stacking the deck in favor of finding something here. And so we see a little bit of an increase there, but it's not significant. Then we're doing another test. We're doing the intent to treat. So now we're looking at books that were available for licensing. So any book with a German-owned copyright could have been licensed, but it may not have been licensed. And so we're using the records of the Swiss National Library, and we're comparing citations to these books with German-owned copyrights with the other German books. And so here you see this is the reduced form estimate, the reduced form data. And again, you see nothing going on until the end of the war. And afterwards, even in this broader sample where there was not selection, right? These are just the books that were available for licensing. So this is, you see that there is an increase. But what that allows us, this test, it allows us to actually estimate how bad the selection effect is. And so we have these, when you're running the regressions with the books with German-owned copyrights, you have a threefold increase. And so when you calculate that, so you put it relative to an uptake ratio of 1/5, it shows that we have a small selection problem. There is some positive selection, but it's really not when you multiply this by the uptake ratio, you get essentially the OLS coefficient. It's not significantly different. So there's some selection, but it clearly cannot affect this large effect that we see. And then we do something which is more becoming very prominent, but this is Mahalanobis matching estimator, because we're not just using the entire sample, which is, I think, the method that I tend to prefer because I'm not really messing with it, but we are now matching the licensed books with Swiss-owned books that were more similar. And so the reason I'm a little bit skeptical of these estimates, and I never just use them rather than, I also like to show the OLS, because I can mess with this and get a better result, right? And you'll never find out. So I'm showing you, like, look, here, we have these estimates. We have sort of constructed them in the way that ex ante we think is the best way of constructing it. But we also have results in the OLS, in the plain OLS, right? You see it in the raw data. That's how I feel like. If any kind of good empirical paper, you should see it in the raw data, and then I can start messing with it. Okay, so in this match sample, we have a 2.4-fold increase. So it's still there. It's there. And again, also, this is the 10% price decline. Okay, so now I'll show you some of the data that we're collecting right now. And this will... I'm not sure we can do this for all of the citations. Because essentially what we're doing is for all of the 12,000 citations, for the citations that we have to these books, we're looking at each of the citing authors, and we're looking at their location. Now, that takes a really long time. So I'm not sure whether we'll actually do this for all 12,000 citations, because it probably takes a year of an RA's life to do this. But so I'm going to show you this for like 2 of the most heavily cited books, which is where we started. And so this is Topologie by Topf and Alexandrov. And so what you see here is that the citations to the licensed books, they move south and they move west. So until the green points are the citations until 1942. And essentially, so there's one, basically a lot of these books, you'll always see a copy in Cambridge, Mass. And then sometimes you'll see another copy in Philadelphia, and you'll see another one in Michigan. But you don't see copies in, like, say, California or Miami. But once the book gets cheaper, then the book spreads. The citations, the scope, or the geographic scope of the citation spreads. But then you may say, like, well, maybe it's just like everything spreads at this time, right? It doesn't really matter. So what we do is we also do this for the Swiss sample. And so the Swiss guys, they just stay. They just literally stay at the East Coast. So this geographic expansion in the geographic scope doesn't happen for the Swiss books. Then, so in our discipline regressions, what we've seen is that human capital really matters. There's another channel through which human capital can also matter, which is the émigrés. And so I've looked at émigré chemists in my other work. And so what we see in that work is that where fields where the U.S. got an émigré, a German Jewish émigré, because of the Nazi laws that essentially dismissed anybody who had a Jewish grandparent from civil service, those fields experience a much larger increase in patenting. So now we have a different setting here. We're looking at books, we're looking at citations, and we're looking again at the emigres. And now we're looking not only at the emigres in chemistry, but also we're looking at the emigres in mathematics. And so what we're essentially doing here is we're comparing books that got the body along with the cheaper price. And so the books that got the body, the books that got the US emigre, that got the guy with the book, those are the interrupted line, and the other ones, the non-US emigres, that's the solid line. So what you see is that it's not just the book, right? If you get the book and you get the guy with it, then you get a much higher effect. Now, this is a really small sample, so I wouldn't really dare to write an entire paper about this because we don't have any power to estimate all the robustness checks that we would have to estimate to get it into a decent economics journal. But essentially, I find it really interesting that we see here, we also see that the emigre is getting getting the human capital along with the book, with the codified knowledge, is really important. And so this is going to be my last slide. So now we will estimate this. So again, we'll do just an interaction. We do a simple interaction with the basic difference. We're interacting that with the emigres. And it's not statistically significant because we have very few observations, but you see it in the raw data. So what this implies is that getting the emigres gets you a 7-fold additional increase. Thank you.
So thank you to Martin and to EPIP for inviting me and for saying nice things about me. And thank you to Petra for a really interesting paper. And I've for some time been a great admirer of Petra's work. Sometimes one is caused to think about who one would like to be as an academic if you weren't confined to being yourself. And Petra's work is such significance, I think, that she's somebody I would like to be. And Martin sets us up as two different ways of looking at history. Petra using history to really learn some big lessons about today, history providing some of the only real laboratories nowadays from which we can learn about the impact of intellectual property rights. In contrast, mostly what I do is enjoyable for me. Some people like to read it, largely pointless, and certainly of much less worth than what Petra does. Now, Petra's paper here, obviously great, very interesting. I didn't even know about the Book Republication program before this. Confirms really what we would have expected to find, which is that copyright has some effects on costs, and that those effects on costs have implications for accessibility of works, and in turn then the influence of those works. And by changing the model, it seems, in fact, that we can see these costs in play because we can see the wider citation of the works. So it seems to confirm what we would expect, and that's great. Now, I don't know anything about economics. I did A-level maths, but I skip all the maths bits in any economist's paper, I'm afraid, and I skip them all in Petra's paper. I have only two skills to bring to the paper. One is that I'm a lawyer, so I'm interested in the legal detail and whether she's overlooked anything that's legally important. And the other is, because I'm a lawyer, I'm interested in whether the argument is plausible. Does it add up, or might there be some alternative or better explanations? So I really have so I want to love this paper, but I don't quite love it yet. And that's partly because I don't understand half of it. So Petra I understood a bit more of it just now. Petra may be able to answer all the things I've got to say that seem a little bit critical of it. And the rest of you in the room who understand her paper better than me may well see that my questions are inane in the first place. So my first point relates to something that you did gesture to, which is the relationship between citation and use. And we had a very interesting session this morning on disclosure in patent law, where it became clear, it was already clear to me because I'd been thinking about it, that citation practices, even within the patenting sphere, vary. Citation is cultural and it is social. So there are different practices of citation in the between Japanese applicants and between US applicants for patents, just even within the narrow sphere of patenting. And citation, it seems to me, varies within disciplines and within different cultural spheres. Citation is also clearly social. When I cite, I'm citing people whose work I admire and I think is meritorious. And when I submit it to an American law review and the student editors add another 500 citations to people whose work I think is not meritorious and I don't want to be associated with, I cross them out. Citation has a cultural and a social dimension. And this means to me that one cannot read citation as indicative of use. In some cases, it overestimates, and in some cases, it very significantly could underestimate. And if you think in terms of use as productive use, as between chemistry and maths, one can imagine that in chemistry there could be lots and lots of use of data without there ever being citations that represent that use. So my first question really is, were you saying that citations indicate use?
So I think I'm going to be an economist, and so that's, I think, maybe where some of the fighting will go on, which those of you who want to see blood on the floor, I think you'll be disappointed. But so, like, yes, I can see if I think there's no information in the citation measure about publications, then you can just throw this entire paper out. Now we have nothing to talk about, right? If, however, you think that what you just told me is just noise, if the citations that they are in your papers after the students have had a handle on it and after you took them out again, if there's still some information, that's what I'm exploiting. Now, the problems that you raise, they are going to be, this is where I'm an economist, they're going to be noise, right? And so what I have to hope, what I have to believe for my test to be valid is random noise, is that it's not differentially going to affect the books that are licensed with relative to the other books after 1942. And then when you go into those smaller tests, with each test that we stack on top of that, we then the worry in some way gets smaller, right? Because then if I look across chemistry and mathematics, then the assumption becomes even smaller. It's just that there can be a differential change.
Okay.
But I'm also a historian.
Yeah.
Right? I'm an economist by training, but I'm also a historian. My heart is also a historian. So as a historian, and also I guess as a sort of a thinking economist, you want to think like, in what cases could that assumption be violated? Now, in this case, there's a clear case of this, which is World War II. And you see it in the dip, right? You see basically is that they don't cite these guys. Even if they have access to these books, they don't cite them during the war. And that may just be precisely what you say. It's like, yeah, I read this book, and I really like it, but the guy is German, so I can't really cite him right now. And then it picks up again later. So, but that dip is what I think your problem is, but I think it's pretty small relative to the overall effect. So basically what I'm doing is I'm using logic to say, when do I think would be the largest problem? And I think the largest problem it would be if I really don't want to cite these Germans, even if I have access to them, because I think they're bad people.
Okay, so let's take the emigres.
Yes.
And you could consider the possibility that the significant increase post-war might be related to emigres, but you only treat emigre authors. And if you think of citation as a cultural process where I cite the people I know, the people I've worked with, etc., the citations the thing that you should be interested in, I think, is not the citations just of German authors, but the citations also by Germans and people connected with Germans, the networks of citations. And could that explain more of the increase in the post-war period than just looking at citations of German authors?
I don't think so, because the quantitative effect is too large. So in our data set, we have 7 emigres, and we have 11,000 citations, or 12,000 citations, right? Those 7 guys, we can take them out. But when we took out the emigres in the paper on the German Jewish scientists, even though these guys were super, super famous, you don't even see it. You don't see any effect. They get washed out, essentially. They may have these network effects through the people that they train. And that's exactly what we're trying to capture with the emigres. I'm not saying it's the emigres themselves. I'm saying it's like this. It's the emigres and the fact of having them here. That doesn't mean that it is actually that guy. It means that it's the presence of this guy, which most likely my intuition is that it's when the emigres came over, they were fairly old. Well, if I tell you the age, then you're going to be upset. But they were like, yes. So, like, okay, they trained lots of people, right? So for a mathematician, they were past their prime, but they actually were able to train lots of other people, and I think that's where they really had the biggest effect. So the emigre variable, in some way, is exactly that proxy that you're looking for.
Okay, so now I want to go to the book republication program itself and different ways in which it might have caused this increase that are not necessarily copyright related. They might come from some of the institutional or other aspects of the book republication program, not just the shift in price. So there are 2 of these, one of which actually I think you dealt with quite nicely, which is the shift in quality. So when you have the Swiss sample, you're comparing you have books that may not in fact have been published at all, as far as I can see from your data, and certainly haven't been selected for republication, whereas the German books are ones that have been published in the United States and been sufficiently successful that you've selected for them. But my concern about whether you've quite nailed that, and this is not so you'll have a straightforward economic answer, I think, is that we know from economic work that citations are winner-takes-all markets. So once you have those, I think we know that. Well, some economists have said it. So lots of people cite Larry Lessig or Pamela Samuelson or Bernd Hugenholtz, and 3 or 4 people cite me. Okay, it's a winner-takes-all type environment, and I'm in the non-winner category. Does your dealing with the qualitative selection allow for the combination of it with citation practice?
No. So the only thing that we're capturing is just the average. So we basically take the average between you and Pam, and then that's it. So we'll take the average. So the institutional stuff, yes, that's something that's one part where this paper is still a work in progress, where so we haven't found, or I haven't found that many of the original sources yet. So a lot of it is from Myron, who was biased, right? So we haven't found yet, and that's something that will just literally just require a trip.
One more shot.
A trip to archives, which is that's on the list.
Okay, I'm only had one more question, which is very mean because I've got quite a number of them. But I want to then come, so there's a question about distribution that you can't answer, and whether the J.W. Edwards had, because they were essentially a single US redistributor of the German books, whether that made a significant difference. But you can't answer that one because that's just an aside. My concern as a copyright lawyer...
It would be easy, though. Okay.
All right. My concern as a copyright lawyer is the Swiss sample. And you've taken the Swiss sample from the Swiss National Library, and it's evident from some things you've said that some of the works weren't even published because you took out the LLM theses and PhD theses. Okay. Now, as a control in copyright terms for the US, you've got a problem, I think, and I'm hoping you've got an answer to this one. And that is that in this period, to have US copyright, the published works would have had to comply with the criterion of the Chase Act of 1891, Section 3. So they would have had to be registered, deposited, and relevant notice, and complied with the manufacturing clause. They had been typeset, not imported into the US.
Yes. So
is your Swiss sample a sample of US copyright protected works?
No. So that's why I say we're using those as a proxy for the books that would have Swiss copyrights. So we're actually, I think you understand what you're asking me to do, right? Which again is we would, for each of these 300 books, we would have to look them up in the non-digitized records of the US Copyright Office between 1900 and 1970, right? So we would either, and I've looked at this before, so this is something that we are doing right now, but again, I'm not sure we can do it for the entire sample because it really means looking up this, basically the copyright status of these books. So we're doing this now for 20 books, and then we'll see how far we get after that.
Because there's a real worry here that in fact you're comparing out of copyright books with books that were in copyright but subject to compulsory licensing.
Yeah, but then
and you're finding that it's better to be in copyright and subject to compulsory licensing in terms of distribution.
But that's where the matching comes in, right? So because the only way that could actually matter is if there's a pre-existing difference in demand. And so that's why we want to do the matching where we use not the full sample of Swiss books, but books that are more comparable to the BRP books in the characteristics that we think are correlated with demand. Now, so that in some way, you're worried about the copyright status, right? And what I'm telling you is like, yes, but the copyright status is going to matter most in the sense that, well, something that's copyrighted in the US, the publisher copyrighted it because they thought this was really a good market for the book. And that's going to be the biggest challenge to my estimates, and that's why we do the matching estimates. But we're also still looking at what you're doing, just not for the entire sample, because it would, again, take years.
Okay, I'm done. Thank you.
Okay. Well.